I never forgot the day I had to deliver the sentence that destroyed lives. I'm Denise Carter, a judge in New Orleans, and that case seemed so simple from the outside, but it was the most painful mistake of my career. Because sometimes, applying the law doesn't mean delivering justice. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It all began with a real estate fraud case, something that here in New Orleans, unfortunately, is not uncommon. An owner of an old building with unpaid debts had manipulated papers to get more money from the bank. For the law, it was clear. He had to be punished. But what no one foresaw was the chaos that would bring to the families of the tenants living there, ordinary people who overnight were left homeless. Who is this owner? Arthur Mills, a businessman with a bad reputation, but mind you, not the typical villain. For the court, just a man committing a serious financial crime. But what happened afterward was an emotional tsunami that no one expected. In court, everything was ready for a quick sentence. Guilty, fines, jail time, and done. But the truth was that the building Arthur manipulated had over 100 people living inside, many of them hard-working families without the means to face an immediate eviction. Among them was Anna, a single mother of 2 children, and Marcus, an elderly man who had lived there for more than 30 years. Warnings from their lawyers and some social organizations saying that sentence would create a human disaster were ignored amid the trial's formality. For me, as a judge, the right thing was to apply the law and make Arthur pay for his crime. But at what cost? When I read the sentence aloud, it was as if a bomb had dropped on the court. Immediate eviction, massive fines for Mills, and very short deadlines for tenants to leave. No one could imagine that this would be just the first of several days when I saw devastated faces, struggling families, scared children, and an entire community on the brink of collapse. The press began covering the issue, and what seemed like a simple legal matter turned into a civic crisis. Parents who couldn't take their children to school, elderly people losing their medicines due to lack of address, and volunteers trying to calm the disaster. And all of this I took home to my office night after night, wondering if that ruling had truly been justice. But the worst came afterward. Arthur Mills, of course, suffered consequences, but the greatest ruin was borne by the innocent caught in the middle. There were protests, lawsuits, and a flood of requests to reopen the case, which failed. And I watched silently as the law took its course, but humanity was left behind. That sentence I delivered was legal, correct in the letter, but devastating in spirit. Justice is not just about punishment, it has to be something more humane, but in those moments, I felt trapped in a system that does not allow for balance. It is something that still haunts me, weighing on me every day when I see people still suffering from the impact of that decision. I never believed that a decision made in an office could have such deep and lasting consequences. That is why today, in front of you, I want to tell this story not to wash away my guilt, but so we can understand that the law doesn't always give the right answer. Sometimes what is just and what is legal are far apart, and when that happens, someone loses. And many times, those who should lose the least are the ones who lose the most. This case changed me. It opened my eyes to a reality hidden in papers and files. Since then, I have tried to look beyond the cold law and seek to balance justice and humanity, even if that is not always easy or popular. Perhaps that is the price of being a judge, carrying decisions that are never black or white, but a gray that hurts the soul. But it is also a lesson for everyone, because in real life, it is not enough to apply the law, we have to understand the people behind each case. If this story has moved you, if you have ever felt that justice fails, leave your comment and tell me how you would face such a dilemma. Because in the end, we are all part of the search, and no one should bear alone the weight of what was legal but not just. The sentence I handed down that morning seemed unbreakable, a decision that, on paper, stood like a monument to justice. However, behind that legal coldness, fractured lives were hidden and a silence I never imagined hearing so loudly. I clearly remember the atmosphere in the courtroom, the restrained murmur among the audience, the fixed gaze of the accused, and the sharp tension that filled the air, as if every word spoken could trigger an invisible earthquake. The accusation was serious and the facts indisputable. Yet, as I pronounced the words that sealed the fate of those before me, I felt a weight in my chest like never before. The responsibility of applying the law rigorously had completely transformed into something much more complex. I was not just judging acts, I was assessing hopes, broken dreams, entire families adrift. I felt as if an invisible wall between the legal and the human was starting to crack into pieces. From that day on, each night I mentally reviewed the moments leading up to my ruling, searching for some detail that would allow me to justify the decision, but also something that would give me hope. But there was no hope in the echoes following that sentence, only a deep sadness nesting in my soul. The following weeks were a whirlwind of calls, reports mentioning the case, and above all, looks. Looks of reproach, of pain, of submission. It was not only the accused who suffered the consequences, their families, their friends, even people unconnected to the case, seemed to pay a very high price. I saw how, within the courthouse walls, the smile of a woman who greeted me at the start of each session disappeared forever. I remembered the despair of a man who, out of my sight, broke down into uncontrollable tears. The justice I believed I was administering was a tool both so powerful and, at the same time, so fragile. I began to notice that this sentence, far from repairing, had sown a deep division in the local community. Groups that had remained united now looked at their neighbors with distrust. The line between what was just and unjust was blurred, and many questioned whether I had truly done the right thing. In those moments, I wondered if justice should be just a cold scale, or if it should consider the human heartbeat that goes beyond any written law. It was then that the case prosecutor called me to express his surprise and concern. Not about my ruling, but about the unexpected social consequences it had triggered. As days passed, I received visits I never thought would knock on my door. Secondary victims of the process seeking to understand, forgive, and in some cases, condemn. It was in one of those conversations that I met Marlene, mother of a young man who had been convicted in the same trial. Her voice was calm, but her eyes reflected a contained storm. She told me that she did not doubt my integrity or knowledge, but that she felt, like so many others, that something fundamental had been lost on the scale, understanding, the possibility of redemption. Her story, her words, and her gaze hurt me more than any public criticism. There, in a small waiting room, I realized that justice imposed without humanity can be an open wound that never heals. The nights weren't easy after that. Many times I found myself tossing and turning in bed, imagining the lives of the condemned, trying to figure out if there had been any alternative that could have changed the outcome. I recalled the face of the main accused, a man I did not see as a monster, but as someone trapped in a web of poor decisions and circumstances that had slipped out of his control. I thought of his children, of the mothers and fathers now mourning a relentless shadow. And that's when I felt that, despite having complied with the law, I had failed at the most complex thing, understanding that behind every judicial ruling there is a universe of emotions and realities that cannot be banished with a simple decree. Over time, the story became more public, not only in traditional media, but in conversations at cafes, neighborhood meetings, and digital forums where opinions crossed with passion and, often, with hate. I noticed how the words justice and humanity began to separate into an abyss, leaving a crack with incalculable consequences. Some voices called for deep reforms in the judicial system, others simply demanded punishment without reservations. And while all this happened, I felt trapped in a limbo that neither side could fully understand. I knew my ruling had fulfilled the letter of the law, but I also knew that in that compliance had sprung a pain no one was willing to repair. I then decided to approach a community group working with people affected by judicial processes. I wanted to understand beyond my papers and sentences. There I found stories so complex and painful that they made me question even more the strict framework within which I had to act daily. A woman told me how, after the trial, she had lost not only her partner, but also the respect and trust of her entire family. Another man spoke of the uncertainty of not knowing when he would see his children grow again. Each story was a fragment of a greater truth than the simple application of the rule. Speaking with these human beings, I realized justice cannot be a rigid and cold structure. It must necessarily be a second look that seeks to balance laws with empathy, legal punishments with hope for repair. I then felt the weight of an enormous personal responsibility. It was not only about judging, it was about seeking ways to humanize sentences, not to abandon those left in ruins after a ruling. It was a revelation that led me to decide not to turn this pain into passive resignation, but into a deep commitment so that, although I cannot change that ruling, I can at least open doors and conversations so that other decisions are not so devastating. I don't know if I will ever be able to erase the image of that day in the courtroom. Nor do I know if the people I affected will find some peace over time. But I know that, since then, my understanding of justice changed forever. Every sentence is more than a legal text. It is an act that carries lives, wounds, and the possibility of redemption or endless condemnation. This experience has haunted me because it reminded me that in the pursuit of justice, we cannot forget that those subject to justice are people with emotions, stories, and dreams. And that a ruling can fulfill the law and yet founder in the deepest part of the human. So today, looking back, I am left with the unrest that our justice needs to evolve. Not to be softer, but to be more human. So that behind every sentence there is not a void, but a bridge toward repair and understanding. Because true justice, I learned the hard way, is not just the cold and exact letter of the code. It is the ability to see, listen, and recognize oneself in the other. And that is a lesson that will not come easy, but one we cannot stop seeking if we truly want justice to fulfill its highest purpose, not just to punish, but to heal. The days following that verdict were a constant test, not only of my professional strength, but also of my deepest humanity. The constellation of invisible effects that decision unleashed upon the community seemed to grow uncontrollably. I had intended, perhaps naively, for the law to be enforced with justice and temperance, but reality struck me with the harshness of lightning on an already stormy night. I recall with unease how the gap between what I believed was just and what the world experienced afterward became increasingly abyssal. Every morning I woke up wishing I could turn back time, find an alternative, a loophole. But none existed. Or at least, not one that my role as a judge could allow me to explore. One day, while reviewing one of the reports related to the trial, a letter with an eye-catching envelope arrived at my office. It was from a man who identified himself as a close friend of one of the convicted, whose voice, from the page, pleaded for a humanitarian reconsideration of the case. I was not expecting those words, yet something in them pierced me. I did not feel anger or resentment, but shared pain, a profound and evident need for someone somewhere to acknowledge that not everything had been fair. The letter spoke of latent inequities, of lost opportunities, but also of hope for a future that seemed closed off. I kept that letter carefully, feeling it was an invisible beacon amidst the darkness that had taken hold of me. Soon more testimonies began to arrive, some through third parties, others directly in visits I never imagined receiving. People who had been shattered in the shadows of the process, searching for a bridge to escape the abyss. They told me of children fatherless, of women who had lost not only a partner, but the strength to move on, of friends who had become bitter enemies, and of neighbors who could no longer cross paths without the weight of judgment in their eyes. In one of those conversations, a young teacher, whose words vibrated with both sadness and courage, shared a phrase that penetrated my soul: justice should not end when the judge strikes the gavel. It should be just the beginning of a path that rebuilds what the sentence has broken. I could not help but feel she was absolutely right. That idea sparked a flame, and with it, a whirlwind of doubts and reflections. If justice must heal, then how did it do so? Is there a way to issue sentences that not only punish, but also dignify those who pay such a high price for their faults? I then remembered Marlene and her devastated gaze, and understood more deeply that the system that seemed infallible walked on fragile ground. Human hearts, always unpredictable, always bleeding. I became aware that, amid procedures and regulations, the necessary flexibility that promotes restoration had been suffocated. And so, slowly, I began to open windows I had kept closed until then. One of those windows was my decision to engage beyond the courtroom walls. I began attending meetings with support groups, reintegration workshops, and community mediations. There, in front of the eyes of those who lived day by day with the consequences of sentences, my sense of judgment began to transform. I could no longer continue seeing people only through the prism of their mistakes. I had to find a way to also recognize their capacity for change and reconstruction. In one of those sessions, I recalled a story of a man who, after serving his sentence, dedicated his efforts to helping at-risk youth, seeking to give them opportunities he never had. His story was not just a testimony of redemption, but a mirror of how justice may have failed to contain restoration, yet the human spirit is capable of transcending it. However, not everything was light in that process. There were moments when the scale tipped to one side and resentment became unbearable. I received criticism even harsher than the initial ones, voices accusing me of weakness, of fostering impunity. I understood that this task was a true battlefield, where every step is watched and judged with the same severity with which I judged others. But I decided that the struggle was worth it because what was at stake was a different model of justice, one that does not settle for being loved or feared, but seeks to be understood in its complexity. I knew that truth is never monochromatic, and that within this play of nuances lies the very essence of full justice. The tension grew not only at the community level, but also within myself. Many nights I found myself trapped in an almost stormy internal dialogue. In those solitary studies, when the city went dark and only the echo of my steps remained, I wondered if I would ever be able to reconcile my personal values with the role the judicial system had entrusted to me. It was not just the sentence itself that weighed on me, it was the certainty that, in the pursuit of applying the law, I had inadvertently sown a division that seemed irreparable. That division multiplied loneliness and, at the same time, demanded that those broken foundations begin to be rebuilt based on empathy and dialogue. I aspired to an understanding that did not erase pain but did offer a path toward healing. The deeper I delved into these reflections, the clearer it became that this case had become a symbol of something much larger, a reflection of the failures and challenges of our justice system. It was not just a personal or local matter, it was a call to rethink the structures that govern how we resolve human conflicts. The law, with all its precision, was necessary, yes, but also insufficient if it left those who suffered without a channel to process their pain, fear, and anger. Sometimes I felt I spoke a different language from those who expected justice only to be punished. And in that gap, I found myself as a woman caught between duty and the longing for a different world. An unexpected turn came when, months after the verdict, I received an invitation to participate in a roundtable organized by activists and experts in restorative justice. The purpose was to discuss not only the case at hand, but also to propose more humane and equitable alternatives so that future processes would not repeat the same destructive pattern. It was an experience that opened doors I never thought to explore. Listening to the voices of victims, the accused, and professionals committed to transforming the system, I understood that we are not doomed to repeat failures, but can raise our eyes and begin to chart paths of connection and reconstruction. I was deeply moved by the participation of some young people who, in their sincerity, laid bare fears and hopes that traditional justice had rendered invisible. These meetings became sacred spaces for me, where the law intertwined with life stories, with all their imperfections and sometimes untamed beauty. I began advocating for methodologies within our judicial system that would allow exploring these human dimensions, so that rulings not only imposed punishment, but also planted the possibility of repair and mutual understanding. It was a cause I embraced with the passion that drives those who have hit rock bottom and seek not only to survive, but to transform. Although the path was arduous, I began to find unexpected allies. Jurists, psychologists, social workers, and community leaders with whom I shared that common vision, a justice that listens and accompanies. Gradually, these initiatives crept into my agenda and decisions. I began to value each story as a universe capable of teaching and, above all, humanizing a system that often seemed too rigid and distant. The feeling of carrying that sentence that had hurt me so deeply began to turn into a drive to seek answers, to spark dialogues that would awaken a tired and wounded community. Of course, it was not a linear process nor free of internal and external conflicts. There were moments when the weight of criticism and doubt returned forcefully, and the deepest question remained intact. Could I, within the system's limitations, make a real difference? There are no manuals for healing the irreparable, nor guarantees for transforming painful legacies. But I understood that the first step was not to remain still, and that justice, at least the one I aspire to defend, must always be something alive, in constant evolution, capable of learning from its own stumbles. And so, beyond my usual duties, I adopted a renewed commitment to turn every experience, every ruling, every wound into a point of reflection and change. Because I understood that in those cracks formed by mistakes and pain, seeds of hope can also germinate. Justice is not an insensitive monster. It is a human construction where law and heart meet, touch, and sometimes rebel. Although that verdict marked a before and after for me, it never allowed me to resign. On the contrary, it was the painful culmination of a process that pushed me to tirelessly seek ways not to repeat the same riddles, so that each ruling becomes an opportunity to listen beyond the paper and the strictly legal. I cannot promise that the path will be easy or quick. The voices of those I affected still resonate in my mind, like a persistent ghost, and a reminder of the importance of never distancing ourselves from the humanity that surrounds every judicial act. Justice, I learned bitterly and hopefully, is much more than sentences and codes. It is the capacity to embrace, understand, and accompany the broken stories that converge in every courtroom. In that mix lies the seed that can transform not only individuals, but entire communities. And although that day in the courtroom happened as it had to, I now know for certain that it is just the beginning of something greater. A process that is far from over and that, of course, I cannot carry alone. I only hope that those who come after carry this lesson in their hearts, that justice without humanity is an empty echo, and that only by listening to others, with our eyes and our souls, can we aspire for it to truly fulfill its purpose. Because the true verdict, I learned painfully, is not in the legal text, but in our ability to ensure that no one is abandoned on the shore. And that is a judgment we cannot fail to render. However, amid that renewed commitment, reality continued to show me its harshest and most complicated side. One night, I received an unexpected call. It was the younger brother of one of the convicted, a young man who had found me at one of those community meetings and who, with a trembling and broken voice, wanted to share with me what had begun to happen after the sentence. He spoke to me about the growing despair in his family, the fights that had arisen from contained frustration, about how the figure of the convicted, who once was a protective older brother, had become a ghost dragging each of them toward a different abyss. And in those words, I found a new reflection of the domino effect that my ruling had unleashed, an invisible chain that seemed to feed on silence and distance. It was not easy to hold that conversation. The mix of helplessness and the deep need to connect with that story struck me with an intensity one felt in every fiber of my body. But it was that very encounter, and the ones that followed in the days after, that pushed me to change strategy. I understood, with a clarity I had not had before, that I needed to do more than listen and reflect. I had to act, even if it was within the narrow margins that my position allowed me. That's how I began to explore the less traveled nooks of the law, those small cracks where flexibility and humanity could be introduced without breaking the institutional balance. What I found was not much, but it was enough to start offering something different: mediation and dialogue programs involving victims and the convicted, spaces where the cycle of silence and estrangement could be broken, to try to build bridges, even if fragile, over the terrain soaked with pain. And it is in those spaces where my most singular and revealing encounters happened. I saw faces marked by suffering, but also by faint hope and fear of failing once again. I especially remember Marlene, whose struggle to keep her family together between the conviction and absence seemed almost heroic to me. In one of those intimate sessions, we looked at each other wordlessly at first, until she broke the silence with a deep sigh and confessed to me something that resonated deeply in my soul. "I don't need the law to prove me right, Denise. I need someone to listen to me, to understand that here there are not only guilty and victims, but people who suffer, who love, and who seek survival beyond the harm." That phrase was a kind of hinge for me because I realized that that sentence, as fair as it was on paper, hadn't even been able to offer a minimal space for that vital human encounter. With each session, with each visit to those support groups that slowly began to take shape, the tension did not disappear but took new forms. On occasions, some family members of the victims had arrived hoping to find answers, only to come across stories and testimonies that challenged the certainties they thought they had. That generated harsh discussions, distrustful looks, and sometimes even verbal violence. I myself found myself caught in reproaches that hurt like daggers, accusations that left no room for understanding. It was the price of opening that bridge, of exposing the cracks where many would prefer to keep the dust and silence. But it was also a sign that something was changing, that justice was no longer a unilateral mandate, but a living and shared process, even if conflictive. The days alternated between small advances and painful setbacks. On one occasion, one of the convicted, someone who had kept a low profile throughout the process, timidly approached me during a meeting and, with a choked voice, confessed that he had started attending a support program to understand his own pain and responsibility. His words, sincere and humble, resonated deeply with everyone present and with me. It was a moment of truce, of true humanity that does not happen in courtrooms, but does in those spaces where the stories behind the sentences are deciphered. Seeing that willingness to change reminded me that even in the most adverse circumstances, the possibility to redeem and heal is an intrinsic part of the human being. However, I also knew that not everyone would be willing to take those steps, and that the battle to foster that openness would be long and arduous. As I progressed in this search, personal tension also grew because I could not help but question whether my work as a judge was dissolving in that direct contact with open wounds. I felt that some voices called me to remain firm and distant, respecting only the hard letter of the law, while others pushed me to risk vulnerability in listening and empathy. That internal division became a fire that burned slowly, and on more than one occasion I found myself doubting if I had the strength to continue on this path that, although legitimate, exposed me to misunderstanding and the judgment of those who saw in my stance a betrayal of traditional justice. But it was a necessary fire because every story I learned convinced me that I could not go back. One of the most difficult moments came when a mother of a victim confronted me in the courthouse, not in the courtroom but in the hallway. With held-back tears and a mixture of anger and pain, she demanded why I hadn't foreseen the collateral damage. How could I tell her that the sentence was fair when it was dismembering the lives of so many families? That question, asked with such desperation, paralyzed me for a moment. I had no easy answers nor formulas to alleviate her pain. I promised her, with a broken voice, that I was working so that something like this would not happen again, that justice needed to learn to be more than punishment. That conversation marked me and reaffirmed the urgency of my new actions, because I understood that justice is also an ethical responsibility that transcends the code. But I did not only face external resistance. Many times, obstacles came from within the judicial system. Some colleagues viewed my intentions with suspicion, warning that restorative logic could put impartiality or the authority of verdicts at risk. They told me I was losing my way, that the law was not fertile ground for sentimentality or experiments that could weaken the structure of justice. Those uncomfortable voices, although painful, made me sharpen my focus, seek a balance between firmness and tenderness, between legal correctness and human flexibility. I began to document the progress of the alternative programs more rigorously and to present cases that demonstrated the effectiveness and value of these repair processes, not to justify myself, but to show that justice could reinvent itself without losing its essence. Meanwhile, the community began to observe those changes, some with hope, others with deep skepticism. At a public event, a group of young people approached me to share their experiences and proposals. They were people who had lived firsthand the stigma of a past conviction, but who had also become agents of change, helping those still trapped in cycles of violence and exclusion. Their stories were a fierce testimony that justice, as it had been conceived until then, not only failed to repair but also to prevent. That renewed perspective was a breath of fresh air, a reminder that to build true justice, one must also open up to those who have been forgotten or condemned without a second chance. However, the ghosts of guilt and pain did not dissipate so easily. On more than one occasion, I had intense nightmares in which I relived the exact moment of the sentence, the faces of those involved frozen in heavy silence, a void that seemed to absorb all hope. In those long, dark nights, the trial was not only about a case or a law, but about my own soul, about my sometimes selfish desire not only to fulfill my duty, but to make a difference. I wondered if justice could truly be a tool for healing without leaving anyone behind, or if it was doomed to always be a cold and insufficient punishment for human complexities. And although those doubts tormented me, they also pushed me to keep seeking answers beyond the codes. An unexpected twist that complicated my path even further came when someone from a conservative sector of society and justice leaked critical fragments of my work in mediation and restorative justice to the press. The criticisms became harsh headlines, questioning my impartiality, suggesting that I was wielding the hammer of justice too lightly and letting crimes go under the excuse of empathy. That public attack generated a storm around me, pushing many to take a defensive stance. For weeks, that media noise was a constant burden that undermined my confidence. But it was also an opportunity to reaffirm my commitment publicly, to explain, open dialogue, and demand that justice is a living field that needs to evolve in the face of social challenges. Slowly, after that storm, a new window began to open in the city. Commissions were formed that included judges, activists, victims, and the convicted themselves to design more comprehensive community justice programs. It was a timid but significant advance. Seeing this, I felt that the pain and anguish of that sentence that had affected me so deeply was not in vain, but the fuel of a slow but inevitable transformation. I knew it would not be enough with a single case or a single person, but that it had to be the beginning of a movement that placed dignity and humanity at the center of the judicial process. And yet, while embracing that idea, I was weighed down by the certainty that no law or initiative will be perfect or infallible. Justice, in its purest sense, remains that delicate balance between reason and heart, a fragile web of decisions that affect entire lives. In that recognition, I found a kind of peace, not the peace of someone who has all the answers, but of someone who accepts that the search is eternal and humility indispensable. I do not know if I will ever be able to close the chapter on that painful case, because every day justice shows me new facets, new challenges, new wounds to heal. But it also showed me that I am not alone, that there is a community willing to walk with me, to try, to bet on something more human and real. In the end, I understood that that sentence, which seemed like a full stop, was actually a silent door, a deep invitation to rethink what it means to judge and be judged. That legitimate justice is not only the one wielding a strict scale, but the one that extends a hand to the fallen, that listens to the echoes of ignored voices, that kneels before pain without fear. Accepting that did not make me less of a judge, but more human, more aware of the enormous responsibility each ruling implies, each word spoken in a courtroom. Because we are not only talking about laws or punishments, we are talking about lives, indelible stories, the urgency of building paths where even the broken can become whole again. And as I write this, I find myself with weight and hope in balance, aware that the path I began to follow after that sentence is as hard as it is necessary. I do not regret or doubt the commitment I made, because I know that in every gaze of those seeking justice and repair there is a call I cannot ignore. And although much remains to be done, my conviction is clear. True justice is the one that knows how to look beyond the code, that listens with the soul, and builds bridges where before there were only walls. That is the legacy I long to leave, not only as a judge but as a human being who learned, almost by force, that the true verdict is not only in the ruling, but in the capacity to leave no one behind in the dark silence of oblivion. The pressure was mounting, and with it, the complexity of each step I decided to take. As the mediation programs became more visible, the echoes of my work spread across the city's neighborhoods, slipping into everyday conversations and the uncomfortable silences of those unwilling to face their wounds. But what no one could foresee was that this limited space, that narrow edge between law and humanity, would also become the stage for deeper conflicts, for internal resistances threatening to overflow everything I had tried to build. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in my office, I received a message that left me breathless. A serious incident had occurred in one of the neighborhoods where the restorative justice system was being implemented, a direct assault on one of the victims participating in the program. At first, I thought it was an isolated act, an outburst of anger from some stranger hardened by the same frustration I had heard in so many voices. But soon, explanations shifted toward something much darker, anonymous threats aimed at families trying to reconcile, pressures to halt the dialogue processes, and a growing sense that the environment was becoming toxic and unworkable. That blow struck me twice as hard. On one hand, the physical and emotional safety of those who dared to take a step towards repair was at risk, and that was unacceptable. On the other, that silent violence appeared as a cascade of consequences from my ruling and the decisions I had made thereafter, reminding me that wounds don't heal easily or quickly, that time and fear can be infinitely more powerful than the will to change. Reality struck again with its hardest fist, and that night, like so many others, I questioned whether I had made a mistake by opening doors that seemed more likely to let in storms than hope. The investigation following that episode led me to uncover unexpected links involving individuals with interests in keeping the status quo intact, people who benefited from fear and social fragmentation. As I read their names and connected their actions to the facts, I had to face an uncomfortable truth. My attempt to humanize justice not only disrupted the judicial ground, but also set in motion external forces that saw in this change a threat. This added an extra layer of danger to my mission, not only for me as a judge, but for all who trusted this path. It was then that the system, instead of supporting me, began to show another face. Some colleagues increased their distance and coldness, relegating me to the shadows of important decisions, as if my pursuit of justice with a human face were an unsustainable luxury. Rumors started circulating in the hallways, suspicious looks, whispers questioning my competence and integrity. I felt how the wall I had so desperately tried to tear down now rose behind me to isolate me, a brutal reminder of the price I had to pay for going against the tide. Amid that isolation, the only breath keeping my will alive were the people, those who kept participating in the groups despite everything. That woman who had confessed her need to be heard, Marlene, came back to visit me with renewed strength. Her eyes reflected deep exhaustion, but also a determination that infected my own doubts. She told me about her progress, about the small wounds that they managed to close when they understood each other, and about the community that, little by little, began to recognize itself in that support network. It was a reminder that, though slow and painful, change was indeed possible. However, the contrast with the latent violence kept setting off alarms within me. Beyond the visible wounds, there were deep scars, an indelible mark of how the traditional system crushed the human element. I clearly remembered that painful moment when the mother of a victim confronted me with a question I still had no solid answer for. Why hadn't I foreseen the collateral damage? Her question haunted me, shattering any justification I could find. It made me aware that in this web, there were not just winners or losers, but many more bleeding in between without comfort or reason. The tension between those opposing truths began to affect my physical and emotional health as well. Sleepless nights became the norm, and in the brief moments of rest, images, voices, and accusations returned more vivid than ever. It was a cruel ritual from which my mind could not escape. But it was in one of those moments of darkness, nearly on the verge of giving up, that I received an anonymous package in my office. It had no sender, only a handwritten letter that said, "The justice you seek is complicated, yes, but necessary. You are not alone." Alongside the letter was a small book on restorative justice, with margin notes showing deep and personal study. That gesture, so simple and yet so profound, made me think that not all was lost. That, although invisible to the public eye, there were those who believed in the same thing I did, people willing to keep the flame of that different justice alive, even if only in the shadows. I felt a renewed impulse to continue, to resist erosion and criticism, to strengthen the networks I so tirelessly built. That letter was an unexpected bomb, a sign that the seed planted had roots beginning to deepen. Shortly after that moment, an unexpected turn surprised even those who had most questioned me. A public event convened to evaluate the initial results of the mediation programs became a space where voices never before heard rose with strength. Relatives of victims and offenders shared their stories with raw honesty, and the most striking thing was to see how, for the first time, some found common ground in their pain, in their guilt, and in their hope for redemption. It was an indescribable moment, fragility made strong, a mirror reflecting the complexity of justice beyond black and white. But behind that progress, latent conflicts soon emerged. The community, which had until then shown interest and openness, began to fragment over differing visions of the path forward. More than once I had to mediate between opposing groups, with cross-accusations ranging from denial of one's own suffering to distrust of others, holding a fragile balance to keep dialogue alive. Justice, I realized, demanded not only laws or processes, but also the ongoing work of sustaining coexistence, forgiveness, and truth in a space where history could not be erased, only transformed. This volatile reality forced me to rethink my own limits and methods. I learned that some steps must be taken slowly, without rushing or false expectations, respecting the time of each story and each soul's peace. I discovered that restorative justice is not a straight path nor a single truth, but a labyrinth where empathy and firmness must coexist, where tolerance and demand alternate to create something new. And above all, I understood that the greatest strength lies in recognizing one's own weaknesses, in accepting that no one has all the answers, but that does not mean we don't seek them. Over the months that followed, a different kind of community consolidated in New Orleans, a network where before there had been confusion and rejection. People who had isolated themselves in their pain began to approach one another, seeking that space where words could flow without fear of judgment. Justice, which seemed like a foreign and merciless institution, became humanized in those meetings, in those exercises of shared vulnerability. And yet, uncertainty always hovered. How sustainable would that change be within a system rooted in rigidity? How much pressure, both external and internal, could it withstand? It was at that delicate point that the word revolution began to be whispered among those of us working for transformation. Not as a violent explosion, but as a slow, quiet perhaps, yet powerful evolution resisting the status quo. In those long nights, when doubt visited me more strongly than ever, I recalled that initial moment when I felt something breaking and the possibility that it could break too. Now I saw that this rupture did not mean losing justice, but expanding it, giving it a soul that not only punishes, but also protects and helps to heal. And yet, the battle was far from won. New cases, different but with similar echoes, showed me that restorative justice was a mirror reflecting all the social fractures our city faced: inequality, prejudice, abandonment. In every session, in every story I heard, I felt the weight of those collective wounds that could not be ignored no matter how much judicial codes tried to dismiss them. I understood that transformation was not only legal but also cultural, and that without that profound change, any attempt would be superficial and temporary. At the same time, these personal tensions continued to beat strongly within me. Between hours in the courtroom, official documents, and formal meetings, there was an emotional space I couldn't exclude, a burden I carried with me and rarely shared. More than once I doubted whether those internal scars were too heavy, whether my desire for human justice was an impossible mission, an ideal clashing with a reality too harsh to be transformed by goodwill and laws alone. But then, a simple phrase, repeated over and over by those who crossed that fragile bridge between punishment and repair, stayed with me: we are not seeking impunity, but complete justice. In that constant learning, in that tireless search, I found the authentic root of my work. Human justice is not that which settles for final sentences or imposed punishments. It is that which recognizes pain, that dares to look inside broken hearts and propose paths where, even if what happened cannot be erased, meaning, understanding, and hope can be built. And though I know this struggle is immense, that the wounds are deep and the road full of stumbles and setbacks, I cannot and will not give up. Because deep down, I know that with every step I take, even if the burden is heavy and the night long, I am honoring the true essence of justice, the humanity that beats in every life, the possibility of redemption. The conviction that no ruling is real if it forgets that behind every story there are people who deserve to be seen, heard, and accompanied. And that conviction, beyond my fears and doubts, is the light that guides me, the reason to keep going, the hope that urges me not to stop, even when everything seems to be falling apart around me. The following weeks were marked by a work pace that seemed endless, but also by an atmosphere of latent tension that seeped into every one of my decisions. It wasn't just external pressure, the critical gaze of my colleagues, or the misunderstanding palpable in the courthouse hallways. It was something deeper, a collective feeling that resisted abandoning old structures, releasing ghosts that had been anchored for years in the corners of the judicial system and in the very essence of our society. I began to understand that the challenge was not only legal or institutional, but rooted in a complex web, an invisible network connecting fear, distrust, and anger with personal interests and pains that no one seemed willing to face head-on. One particularly gray afternoon, while reviewing a case that seemed to repeat far too often, I received a call that shattered the fragile balance I had managed to build. On the other end of the phone was the trembling voice of a program coordinator informing me that one of the families involved had decided to abandon the process, just after making progress in a dialogue that seemed promising. The reason was a new threat, this time more explicit, directed not only at them but also at their neighbors and friends, as if the shadow looming over the program wanted to spread without limits. I felt a sharp blow to my chest, a bitter mix of helplessness and frustration that made me question how far I was able to protect those who opened their lives and souls in the hope of healing. It was not a minor problem nor a simple coincidence. That threat symbolized the irreconcilable clash between a project trying to sow reconciliation and a sector of society that found in conflict and division fertile ground for its own survival. I began to perceive that violence did not only come from external actors, but also manifested in subtler ways within the system itself, in apathy, in the lack of real support, in the bureaucracy that hindered, without many noticing, the effective deployment of those restorative processes. The paradox was cruel. I wanted to build bridges, but the cement needed seemed slow to arrive, and instead, the cold wind of skepticism blew hard. I decided, then, to meet with the security officials and community leaders who had participated in these initiatives. It was a tense meeting, pierced by urgency and concern, but also by accumulated fatigue. In those conversations, I glimpsed the magnitude of what we were facing, networks of influence extending beyond the neighborhood, dark connections with political and economic sectors that saw social fragmentation as a tool to perpetuate their power. It was a labyrinth in which each discovery seemed to open more questions than answers. The more I investigated, the more aware I became of the immensity of the challenge and how ill-prepared we were to face it without collapsing. I often found myself questioning my own decisions, wondering if such a different and complicated path was worth the price we seemed to be paying. The faces of victims, the convicted, and their families mingled in my thoughts with the voices of those outside who criticized and dismissed my efforts. But the most painful certainty was acknowledging that I had no way to guarantee security for those committed to these processes, that I could not fully protect them from the weight of rejection and violence that pulsed like a constant undertow. In those moments, I felt the most absolute loneliness, trapped between the need to continue and the real fear of failing them. One night, while working on the reports I had to submit to the court, the phone rang. It was Marlene, the woman whose story had moved me and who, despite everything, remained firm in her desire to move forward. Her voice, though tired, carried renewed determination. She told me that despite fear and obstacles, they had achieved a small breakthrough. A small group of families had decided to organize themselves to watch over each other, to protect themselves, and not let those threats gain ground. She spoke of how, on the hardest nights, they found refuge in their own community and in the conviction that although slow and fragile, change was possible. It was a powerful reminder that I was not alone, that behind each case there were people who, with their daily struggles, kept that spark of hope alive. However, that night she also confessed something that shook me: the fragility of that network, the constant feeling of being on the brink of collapse, and the urgent need for support, not just moral, but real and tangible. She made me understand that restorative justice could not live only in documents, sentences, or good intentions, but needed a broader community commitment, visible support that showed no one faced these battles alone. It was a revelation that forced me to rethink my role, not just as a judge, but as part of a much larger process where collaboration and solidarity were essential. With that idea in mind, I decided to convene an open forum, trying to connect more stakeholders: local authorities, civil organizations, community leaders, and representatives of the families. I wanted all voices to be heard, to empathize with the stories behind the numbers and statistics. The meeting was intense, charged with emotions and contradictions, but it was also a complete reflection of how complex this path we had decided to walk was. Heated debates arose, moments of frustration, but also hope. Some ideas emerged clearly: the need for training courses for mediators, greater police presence coordinated with the community, accessible psychological support centers, and above all, a sincere and constant institutional commitment. But not everything was so linear. Amid that dynamic, an unexpected accusation appeared. A relative of a convicted person claimed that behind this entire initiative were hidden interests seeking to manipulate the system in favor of certain political groups, and that I myself was being used as an unwitting pawn in that network. The words cut deep, not only because they wounded my integrity, but because they revealed the deep distrust that still existed toward any form of change. That accusation brought with it echoes of rumors and questioning that once again left me in a vulnerable, exposed position, even questioned by those who had previously shown support. Facing this internal and external storm, I had to summon strength from where there was barely any left. I understood that the weariness did not come only from physical or emotional burden, but also from the constant struggle to keep focus, not losing sight of what really mattered amid so many distractions and attacks. I decided I had to be more transparent, open the dialogue more with the community and with my colleagues, not to justify myself or seek approval, but to build trust. To show that the process was not an individual adventure, but a collective path with its successes and mistakes. In those conversations, I discovered something that changed my perspective. I was not alone in my conviction, but I was often alone in the daily fight involved in transforming a system accustomed to punishing and forgetting. There were invisible connections with activists, social workers, educators, and other agents who also believed in that ideal of justice with a soul. Together, we began to weave a stronger network, to find ways to protect families, to build safe spaces where stories could be heard without fear, and to prepare new generations to rethink justice from another viewpoint. It was a discreet process, without big headlines or public recognition, but with an intensity that gave me back the strength to continue. As we advanced, I felt the city itself beginning to breathe differently, though with slow and hesitant steps. Small gestures crossed divided neighborhoods, and in those moments, when I saw the possibility of a change that transcended the legal to touch the human, I understood that every blow received had been worth it. However, I also knew that those changes were far from consolidated, that fragility persisted, and that the shadow of violence and resistance was always lurking. One cold night, as I was preparing to leave the office, I received an anonymous call. The voice, barely a whisper, warned me that attempts to stop the transformation process were increasing, that there were forces willing to reverse all that had been achieved, even at the cost of sowing fear and distrust in the community. I couldn't help but feel a chill run through me. It was a clear warning that the path would be even harder, that every step forward would be paid with confrontations, and that stability was an illusion. But in that same call, I felt a strange recognition that the struggle for humane justice was not an ingenuous utopia, but a real and crucial battle worth fighting with every breath. Back in my office, I looked at the small book I had received some time ago, that manual full of notes that had returned hope to me in dark moments. The words written in the margins resonated with renewed strength. Justice is not measured only in sentences, but in rebuilt lives and open hearts. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing myself to feel the weight and responsibility, but also the determination that kept me standing. I knew the path was long, full of sacrifices and doubts, but I also intuited that every effort, every listening, every gesture of solidarity was a step toward a future where justice not only punished, but truly healed. And in that mixture of fear and hope, fatigue and renewed strength, I understood that the real sentence, the one that would always hurt me most, was not the one I handed down in court, but the one imposed by the reality of a system that, despite its flaws, could still change if it found in our hands the tools to humanize it. It was not an end, but a beginning that, although uncertain and fragile, carried with it the promise that even when everything seems to collapse, justice can be reborn in the hope of those who dare to believe in it. The following weeks became even more complex, and a sense of constant vigilance settled into my life. I not only felt watched behind the courtroom doors, but I also began to perceive that this pressure extended to my closest loved ones. The anonymous messages kept arriving, with tones ranging from veiled threats to direct insults. It was a corrosive mix, designed to destabilize me, to make me question whether all the effort was worth it or if I was simply stepping into a terrain that would end up consuming me. At night, while silence filled the office, I would spend hours staring at my phone with the screen black, wondering who might be on the other end of the line and what price I was willing to pay to stop this path. But one afternoon during a visit to the community, everything took another unexpected turn. I was accompanied by some young volunteers who helped in training and prevention workshops when a middle-aged man approached timidly. His face was marked by years of struggle, with a mix of weariness and hope in his eyes. He introduced himself as Marcus, a neighbor who had lost a son in a violent event linked to local disputes. His testimony was not just any story. He told me, with a broken voice, how violence and distrust had poisoned everything around him, from personal relationships to the very institutions we were supposed to trust. But he also confessed something deeper, that for a long time he had been trapped in a lack of will to change, chained to the idea that justice was only punishment and that nothing could heal those wounds. Until I heard what you were doing here, he told me, and saw that someone believed in us, in our ability to be more than victims or executioners. It was a revelation that reminded me why I had chosen this path, but it also struck me with the tremendous responsibility that transforming those words into concrete actions meant. However, that encouraging encounter did not extinguish the obstacles that multiplied like shadows as night fell. During a hearing I attended shortly after, a group of people burst in with shouts and banners, accusing me and my colleagues of betraying justice, of being accomplices to a corrupt system that rewarded impunity. It was a humiliating and heartbreaking episode, but also another sign that our struggle touched sensitive nerves, challenged powerful interests, and questioned truths that had been settled for too long. As I looked at those faces full of rage and pain, I understood that applying the law was not enough, nor even promoting restorative processes in closed circles. We needed to overcome ancient fears, dismantle prejudices, and build a new culture, one that recognized the humanity we all share, even in those we had condemned. Amid that chaos, I received a call that once again put all the work at risk. I was informed that someone from the team had leaked confidential information to sensationalist media, distorting facts, manipulating the truth to feed a narrative contrary to the progress we were trying to achieve. I felt a mixture of betrayal and despair, as if the ground disappeared beneath my feet. This not only endangered the integrity of the program, but directly attacked the families seeking to heal and change. Trust, that delicate thread we had woven with so much effort, seemed to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The paranoia, which until then had been contained, now openly settled in the atmosphere. That night, after turning off the light at home, I lay staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I wondered if the price of this fight would end up being not only the constant threat, but also the erosion of the very justice I wanted to defend. The phrase that escaped me in whispers was cruel. Is it worth it? However, just as discouragement seemed ready to take hold of me, a message appeared on my phone. It was from Marlene, the same woman who had stood firm from the beginning. Her words were simple but powerful. "You are not alone, Denise. We are still here, resisting. Because we know this path is difficult, but we also know it's the only one worth walking." That message returned a spark of courage to me, a reminder we often forget that justice is not just a solitary act, but a collective construction that endures even when everything seems to collapse. The next day, at the open forum I had convened, the atmosphere was expectant, almost electric. We knew that meeting could mark a before and after or sink the project definitively. As hours passed, I heard testimonies of accumulated pain, bitter frustrations, and half-fulfilled dreams. There were uncomfortable encounters, harsh debates, and also moments of unexpected tenderness when families shared their small victories, the progress that seemed invisible to outside eyes, but that for them meant a new life. The tension was palpable, but so was a collective will beginning to open paths, to forge real and tangible commitments. There, among those diverse voices, I knew that despite the attacks and doubts, the seed we had planted was beginning to sprout. However, just before closing the session, a revelation shook everything. A young mediator, with a trembling voice, confessed that several team members had received offers to abandon the project, with economic promises and veiled threats. He explained that these attempts were not just sabotage efforts, but part of a larger scheme, a perverse game to maintain the status quo and prevent restorative justice from taking hold in the community. It was a dark moment, one that reminded us how much was at stake and the vulnerability embodied by those of us who dared to challenge entrenched structures and false securities. But it was also a clear call to action, to strengthen our bonds and not allow fear to paralyze us. With that new information, we redoubled efforts to guarantee the safety and support of all involved. Because I understood that the justice I dreamed of could not be just a distant ideal, but a tangible commitment to real life, to uncertainty, to the invisible struggles faced by every person who lends their voice and time to this path. It was an exhausting process, yes, but also transformative. I learned to accept that failure was a possibility, a shadow that would walk alongside us, but that true defeat would be to give up, to let fear overcome us, and for everything to collapse without even offering a chance for change. Over the months, what seemed like a simple legal process became something much deeper, a movement that transcended the courtroom and signed papers. And when I finally saw families reunited, young people actively participating in dialogue workshops, neighbors working side by side to protect and strengthen their community, I knew not all was lost. That pain, criticism, and resistance were part of the path, but that hope, fragile and small as it might seem, had the strength to break down walls and open wounds toward the possibility of true justice. That night, as I closed my office curtains and looked out at the city through the window, I felt an indescribable mix of tiredness and serenity. The justice I had delivered, that legal sentence so clear in its terms, still weighed on my soul, but no longer defined me entirely. I had learned that in this constant pursuit, authentic justice is also a struggle of resilience, patience, and, above all, shared humanity. With steady pulse and intact awareness, I knew that no matter how many times everything seems to collapse, as long as there are those who dare to believe and act, justice can be reborn, not in the cold text of a decree, but in the warm light of lives transformed and rising again and again.